Zevlor's Sleep Stories. Performed by Glenn Macready. Annie by Celeste Williams. Hell Riders are famous for their prowess in mounted combat, but few outside of our ranks understand how we gain that skill. When I first enlisted, we trainees weren't given specific horses to ride. Instead, we changed mounts almost daily. The idea was to help us learn how to work with different animals' personalities and quirks. After all, it is the job of the rider to adapt to his mount, not the other way around. However, before trainees are allowed to become fully fledged hell riders, they must undergo a rite of passage. Each trainee is given a young horse to train themselves. These horses were ours, and we rode no others from that moment forward. Only once our horse was fully trained and prepared for service could we graduate from trainee to true hell rider. I still remember when I first met her. She stood in her stall, the most beautiful animal I had ever seen. A blood bay with rich brown coat the color of garnets and black mane, tail, and legs. Her only marking was a bright white snip on her nose. She was not affectionate in the slightest, not at first anyway. When I offered her an apple in my outstretched hand, she didn't even deign to sniff at it. Instead, she stood proud and confident, fixing me with an intelligent look that made me feel as though she was evaluating me rather than the other way around. The look of eagles, we called it. She had heart and would make a fine warhorse someday. Despite her aloofness, I gave her a sweet name, Annie. I think I hoped giving her such a name would soften her towards me. Annie had other ideas. When we began our training, I found her to be the most stubborn animal I had ever met. She wasn't mean, no, just independent, opinionated, intelligent to a fault, and utterly unconvinced that I was strong enough to lead her down the road, let alone ride her into battle. Catching her from her pasture required nearly as much strategy as war. She would see you coming with her halter, look you in the eye, and let you get just close enough to think you could touch her. But right before you could, she would spin on her haunches, kick up her heels, and run off into the distance. And once you caught up to her, she would do it again. I learned to approach slowly, pretending as though my greatest intent was to take a nice walk in the field, all while hiding her halter behind my back. Once I got close, I would bribe her into standing still with carrots in order to put the halter on her head. Working with her in the barn was no simpler. She was well behaved enough while I groomed her coat to prepare her for our day's activities, and stood patiently while I untangled the burrs and knots from her thick tail each day. But the moment my back was turned, she would reach out to the rope tying her to the hitching post grab it with her teeth and pull, undoing the knot keeping her there. More than once I returned from a quick trip to the tack room to an empty hitching post, and Annie several hundred yards away, innocently grazing, as though she had been there all along. Though she frustrated me, I had no desire to see that spark in her eyes quenched. I knew that her independence would make her a great warhorse some day. So, while some of my peers resorted to harsh methods with their mounts, breaking their will at the expense of their spirit, I took a different, albeit slower, approach. Every moment I could spare, I would jog to the stables and spend time with Annie. I was determined to convince her to trust me as her leader. I spent hours grooming her coat until it gleamed even in the dim light of the stables. She had a spot just beneath her withers at the base of her neck that she particularly loved to have scratched. When I reached it with the currycomb, she would lean her weight into me, stretching out her powerful neck as if to say, "Yes, right there, that's the spot." When I moved the currycomb a bit lower, to her shoulder, she would sometimes turn her head to gently nibble on my shoulder, as if to groom me as well. She always seemed to understand that I was more fragile than she, and would never bite too hard. Occasionally, after evening mess, if I didn't have a watch to stand, I'd head to her stall and sit underneath her hay manger, cast a light cantrip, and read a book of the great poets of Faerun, while she contentedly munched above me. Sometimes I would even doze off, lulled by the soft, gentle crunch of hay and the comforting smells of straw, dust, and horse. I would wake up to the feeling of velvet-soft lips on my ear, a gentle warm breath in my hair, and a curious, almost amused look in her large, dark brown eyes. Spending time with her like this paid off. Over time, she seemed to do more than just tolerate my presence. I think she even began to look forward to it. When I came down to the stables at night with an apple in hand and called her name, she began to stick her head out of her stall, ears pricked with interest, a gentle throaty whicker greeting me. Teaching her to wear a saddle was almost laughably easy. She stood loose in her stall the first time I placed it upon her back. When I did so, she barely flicked an ear in my direction, more interested in the hay in front of her than what I was doing. She took to wearing a bridle just as easily. The first time I sat upon her was a special moment. A fellow trainee stood at her head, holding her in place as I carefully laid myself across her back, waiting for an explosive reaction that never came. Once I was sure she was calm, I stretched my leg over her back and sat upright. I scratched her favorite spot at the base of her neck and praised her. In response, she turned her head back to me and gently lipped my leg, as though to say, "We're in this together." After such an auspicious start, I thought for sure that my work had paid off, and that Annie would be easy to train from that moment on. She had other ideas. I struggled to teach her the basics of being a riding horse, because, as I quickly discovered, she hated being ridden in the manege, That's a building for riding horses indoors, for those of you non-hell riders. Like all enclosed riding arenas, ours was dark, dusty, and claustrophobic. Annie had a particularly nasty habit of jumping to the side and spinning around in the opposite direction whenever she spooked, which, in the manège, was often. I regularly found myself in the dirt with Annie staring down at me as though confused by how I had ended up there. Faced with this next challenge, I was struck by a memory of my very first pony, an ancient creature named Arthur. He was so old and missing so many teeth that we had to soak his food in water to make a soup that he could drink. His coat was shaggy and long, even in the heat of summer, his mane and forelock so full it was a wonder he could even see. And he was missing half an ear, which he'd lost to frostbite during a bitter winter long before I was born. As a young boy, whenever I could sneak away from chores or schoolwork, I would head to his pasture. There I would clamber onto him from the ground, with nothing but my balance and his thick mane to keep me on his back. He and I spent hours together, I atop him and he kindly tolerating me as he wandered the hills searching for spots to graze. Our rides were haphazard and peaceful, with no goals or pressure, just a boy and his pony enjoying the lazy heat of summer together. Remembering the joy I found in the quiet hours spent on Arthur's back, I took Annie out of the manège and into the fields. Out of doors, she transformed from the spooky and unpredictable horse she had been into a proud and confident war-horse. We marched up and down the lanes between fields, her ears pricked forward with enthusiasm as she took in what she must have considered to be her kingdom. My favorite was to take her out for a ride just before dawn, when the world was quiet and still. We would stop and watch the sunrise together over the golden hills outside the city, the soft padding of her hooves and the creaking of leather tack joining with bird calls into a gentle symphony that only we would ever hear. And sometimes, when we lingered too long and I risked being late for morning formation, we would break that peace as I urged her into a gallop back towards the stables. Her gallop was exhilarating, like riding an avalanche. I would feel her muscles bunch and hear the wind roar in my ears as her legs moved faster and faster underneath me. As we flew down the same lanes we had just sauntered up, I couldn't help but laugh, breathless, as I held on and experienced her true power. On these rides we learned to speak to one another. She learned that a squeeze with my legs meant go faster, and when I sat tall and held the reins firm, it meant to slow down. I learned that she would toss her head if I grabbed the bit in her mouth too hard, and that she would gladly buck me off if I used the spur harder than she deemed appropriate. She taught me how to be her partner, not her master. Annie never did get over her dislike of the menage, but a warhorse isn't created within the safe confines of 4 dark walls. The time I spent developing our relationship and earning her trust in me paid off once we progressed from basic riding to combat. She was the bravest horse I ever had the privilege of sitting on, boldly leaping over fences or off of embankments without question, because I had asked her to do it. And the proud confidence she had shown, that look of the eagles when I first met her, proved invaluable in skirmishes. She would charge down the enemy without a second thought. More than once Annie saved my life, spinning us out of the range of an attacker that I could not see, kicking out to be sure they did not follow. For all the sweet nature she developed, she did have a bit of a mean streak that she never fully lost. The Hell Riders decided to retire Annie after several years of service, in the hopes that she would breed and provide us a new generation of warhorses. She produced 3 foals, one of whom, a lovely blood bay colt with only a small white snip on his nose, was the spitting image of his mother. By the time he was old enough to start his career in the Hell Riders, I was high-ranking enough that I could pull some strings, as it were, and I got myself assigned as his rider. He was sweeter than Annie ever had been, gentle, trusting, and dependable. He was reliable on patrol and courageous in battle, but he never quite matched Annie in spirit or ferocity. Still, I like to think that when we paraded down the roads next to the pasture where she spent her retirement, she was proud of us both, her son, and the Hell Rider she trained.